the uncertainty is small compared to the change. So the physics there is very straightforward. It's the real world that's telling us what the...
Hey, everybody. So just popping up here live.
Far better than
to
in which you can get any
give you a live look at the press questions for Jim Hansen and his colleagues, Leon Simon and others, on a hot new paper, another Hansen paper et al. With a large group of scientists purporting that current estimates of climate sensitivity, the sensitivity of the climate to doubling CO2 in the atmosphere, is way too low, and that there's several factors that have gone into them raising their estimate. And the paper is controversial. You're right now, Seth Borenstein's question was basically a bunch of scientists have said this is hyperbolic. So now I'll let you listen.
Oh, well, that was the third part, but let me let me answer that third part. No, if you look at the temperature change since 1970, it's been basically was a straight line. It's linear from 1970 up to the past decade. And the point that we're starting at, if you saw the charts that Leon showed, and the change in the aerosols occurred from China and from the shipping beginning in about 2010. That's the reason to have that as the hinge point. And it's not at an extreme, at an El Nino or a La Nina. We take the mean of that curve. So there's no, it is an objective way to do it. And the other part, and this may be what I was forgetting about the second part, the physics is very clear. The warming is due to the planetary energy imbalance. So you got more energy coming in than going out. The planet warms up. We've now got we've doubled the imbalance, and that's going to increase the warming rate. Now, it's not simply based on the current imbalance. You have to integrate over time, and you're getting still getting some warming from additions to the imbalance that occurred 100 years ago. But as we show quantitatively in the paper, you would still expect at least a 50% increase in the warming rate. And that's what we will soon find out, because the next few years will show that indeed we do have an acceleration in the global warming rate.
Thank you.
It's based on simple, good physics. Just look at the paper, you'll see that.
Jim, thank you very much. Just to say, we're short of time. There are a number of questions that have been asked on the chat, and we will share those questions with the authors afterwards. So some of you may get feedback by email. But in the meantime, let me ask Gloria Dickey of Reuters to be next.
Yes, thank you for doing this. I just wanted to ask, to kind of put this into the context of, the global climate diplomacy and upcoming talks at COP28, if 1.5 is indeed dead, so much of the rhetoric, of course, is keeping 1.5 alive. How do you kind of square that with what we're going to see in a few weeks? I mean, are world leaders kind of living in an imaginary world at this point? What should the aims be of these talks? How long do you expect it will take, kind of policy and discussion to catch up to thinking that 1.5 is dead? Just kind of where do we go from here? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that is a shortcoming of our scientific community, to not make clear to the political leaders what the situation is. 1.5 is deader than a doornail. And anybody who understands the physics knows that. And when you look at the real potential, if you look at the energy story, you will understand that you are not, the rest of the world is not going to suddenly get off of fossil fuels. They're just too convenient. They raise standards of living. As I have said a number of times, 1 gallon of gasoline contains more than 400 hours of labor by a healthy adult. And as I showed a graph on the carbon intensity of energy, we've reduced it from 0.8 to 0.7 in 50 years. It's not going to go to 0 in a few decades. And there are no plans to do that. And as Pushker's charts showed, the assumptions that are made in these integrated assessment models that IPC is using are just inconsistent with the real world and what is happening. So we're also going to pass 2 degrees. That's clear, unless we take actions to affect the planet's energy balance. And all those models, by the way, do not include the decreasing aerosols and the large additional burden that puts. 1 watt per meter squared is an enormous forcing to try to overcome. I mentioned that if you want to do it by extracting CO2, it costs you more than $100 trillion. It's not going to happen. So so young people need to understand what they are being handed by the older generation. They can't allow this fake stories to mislead them. They're going to actually have to affect the politics so that the special interests do not control, and especially the fossil fuel industry, does not control the future. And in the United States, you can't solve the problem with 2 political parties that are both taking money from the special interests. I think that, in my opinion, we're going to have to get a party that takes no money from special interests, and that's the only way we'll get policies that young people want and are needed to assure their future.
If I could just add a word, just to be absolutely clear, the fact that 1.5 degrees C is going to be exceeded must be interpreted properly to mean the emergency is much greater than these politicians either know or pretend. It's not that it's less or that there's less reason for action. There's much more reason for action at a much more urgent pace. And that's the real message of all of this. So it's not to exonerate lazy politicians who have done little till now. It's to tell them that their fakery is exposed because the rate of warming is higher, the emissions continue to rise, the drama that the planet is entering is much greater than they pretend. And so the action has to be commensurate with that reality. I just want to be absolutely clear that this isn't used to mock the idea of action. It's the opposite. It's to mock the inaction. It's to say that the emergency is much, much higher than people realize right now. And I just want to add that point. If we could turn to Adam Vaughan of Times of London.
Hi, thanks for doing this. James, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. Are the 5 warmest months in a row that we've seen this year a sign of the acceleration you're talking about in your paper? How worried should we be by those temperatures? And I just wanted to ask, just to put your estimate on climate sensitivity in context a bit, if you could do that. So you're saying 4.8 degrees for a doubling of CO2, which is obviously a lot more than the IPCC. I don't think it's, and I'm obviously not a scientist, I don't think it's completely out of line with other literature, is it? So I just wondered if you could just put it in context a little bit with what we've known before. Thank you.
I'm not sure I understood the question, but the 4.8 degrees is actually not outside of the IPCC range. They tend to give very large ranges, but they said their best estimate was 3 degrees Celsius. And it's clear from the real world response to the change in forcings between the glacial and interglacial periods that 3 degrees is excluded. It's higher than that. It could be the uncertainty at 1.2 degrees would mean that 4 degrees Celsius is a possible sensitivity, but even that is much larger than the 3 degrees. Now,
and Jim,
may not have understood the question.
Yeah, the first question was, what should we make of the record-breaking temperatures of the recent 5 months? Is this part of the evidence of what you're arguing?
Yeah, absolutely it is. If you look at the, part of the problem is separating signal from noise, and you have a large natural variability of global temperature, especially associated with the tropical cycles, the southern oscillation. But you can minimize that effect of that variability by looking at the peaks of the large El Niños. And the most recent large El Niño was only 8 or 9 years ago. And yet the warming since then, it's already clear, is going to be comparable to the warming that occurred between the prior super El Niños, which was more like 18 years. So the rate is almost double. And that's not surprising because the planet's energy imbalance is double. So heat is pouring into the planet at twice the rate. And that is a principal reason why we're getting these extremely large month after month global temperatures.
Thank you. Could we turn to GRIST? And if we have time, we'll finish up with Alejandro de la Garza at Time Magazine. We're running late, but let's try to get to 2 more questions in.
Hi, yeah, my name is...
And if you could be quick, please.
Yes, of course. I had a question about tipping points, which is, what are the implications of those given that your research shows will reach 1.5 by the end of the decade? Thank you.
Yeah, the most important tipping point is the Antarctic ice sheet, and in particular, the Thwaites Glacier, whose grounding line has been moving inland at a rate of about 1 kilometer per year. And in another 20 years, it will reach a point where the bed is so-called retrograde bed. So it gets deeper. The Antarctic ice sheet sits on bedrock below sea level, but it gets deeper as you go toward the center of the continent, and it hits a canyon in about 20 years if we continue at 1 kilometer per year. When it hits that canyon, you're going to get very rapid disintegration of that glacier, which is basically the cork that's holding a lot of the West Antarctic ice in the bottle. So we don't want to get there. And if we want to slow down, and even stop the melting of the Antarctic ice sheet, we'll have to cool off the planet. That's and we need to do that because more than half of the large global cities in the world are on coastlines, and there are a lot of lowlands. So that's the tipping point, which I think dominates. But it so happens that there's so many other climate impacts that we're beginning to see, and which will be much more if we go beyond 2 degrees, that there are many reasons to want to cool off the planet. If we want to keep a planet that looks more or less like the one that has existed the last 10,000 years, we actually have to cool off the planet back to a Holocene-level temperature. And that's possible, but it's not easy.
Maybe if you could just say one more sentence on that. That is essentially Mr. De La Garza's question. What do you mean by cooling off the planet?
I mean cooling it back. You know, it was comparable to what it was before the.
But how is the question?
Oh, how? Well, we're going to have to reduce emissions as rapidly as practical, because otherwise any artificial ways to cool the planet are going to be overwhelmed. But we know when Pinatubo went off, it put aerosols in the stratosphere, which changed the planet's energy budget by 3 watts per meter square reduction. If you had that now, you know, that actually cools off the planet. That's more than enough to put you from warming into cooling. So there are ways to do it, and not just putting aerosols in the stratosphere. There you can have autonomous sailboats putting sea salt in the atmosphere and seeding clouds, which many people would consider more innocuous than putting aerosols in the stratosphere. But rather than describe those efforts as threatening geoengineering, we have to recognize we're geoengineering the planet right now. This is what we're doing with these huge greenhouse gas amounts in the atmosphere, is forcing the planet at a rate 10 times greater than has ever occurred in the Earth's history, as far as we know. We have to minimize that human-made geoengineering, and on a temporary timescale, that will probably require reflecting sunlight, just because of how difficult it is to get the greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. We're not going to do such a thing this year or next year. People have to understand the situation. They have to see that the problem is getting worse and worse, and we have to understand the implications better. But we're
doing the opposite. I think that's important to make clear, that we're now doing the opposite of reflecting more sunlight. We are reflecting less sunlight.
Yeah, that's why the warming rate is accelerating, because we're actually decreasing human-made aerosols. But when you, we have to compare the current geoengineering with the strong warming that causes, and all the problems that's going to cause at low latitudes, and increased storms and increased floods and things, with the situation where we bring the temperature back down, and it may have regional effects, but overall the global climate effects are surely much less than if we continue on this path and get several degrees of global warming.
I think we're going to have to close, because we're 10 minutes after the hour. I want to thank everybody for participating. Please, everybody, make sure that you have the paper. It is an extraordinarily important paper. And we have a number of questions in chat, which we will convey to the authors, and I'm sure that the authors will also be ready to follow up with you directly by email. And if we could put a link Alice, in the chat for people to follow up directly with you so that we can help to intermediate the questions. Let me thank everybody again, and we're in a grim situation, and I think that's clear. It's even grimmer that the politicians have failed their responsibility to the world now for quite a long time. I, for one, am horrified to put them in a position of further engineering a disaster when they can't even do the straightforward things. But that's a time for another talk and another discussion. We have a massive political failure. Our politicians like wars. They don't want to save the planet in the right way. So let's bring it to an end now. And thanks, Jim. Thank you, George, Pushker, Leon, and Norman for a extremely important contribution to the scientific and to the public understanding. And thanks to the colleagues at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network for arranging this conversation with the world leading climate scientists. And best wishes to everybody today. And bye-bye.
Thank you, Jeff, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so that was a funky pop-up. Hopefully you could hear the conversation. I had to use the microphone directly on the computer because Zoom doesn't allow you to directly stream a Zoom webcast through StreamYard. Anyway, this is the paper that was just being discussed by Jim Hansen, Leon Simon, and other co-authors, a real gaggle, some NASA scientists, other independent scholars. The paper is provocative. Jim has a history of writing provocative, sprawling papers that are good because they're provocative and sprawling, and they allow others to come in and say, well, what about this and what about that? This, unlike something he did a year in 2015, when Jim released a paper before peer review, this one is peer reviewed, although it's it's not in one of the top flight journals. It's in a good journal, and it made it into the literature. Improved knowledge of glacial to interglacial global temperature change yields Charney, meaning the background climate sensitivity doubling CO2 of 4.8 C. That's the very high end of what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has posited for this. What would happen with a doubled CO2 in the long run? 4.8 C is at the high end of the range, and their new analysis excludes the IPCC's current low end of the range. That's part of why this paper is getting a lot of attention. As you heard, if you were listening, scientists not involved with this particular paper many are skeptical. It is trying to do a lot of integration of data from different sources in ways that are novel and contentious, but it's important. I may try to reach out to Leon Simon, who is one of the architects of this, probably busy, see if I can get him in here briefly. Otherwise, I'll close this out fairly soon. One thing that's kind of troubling to me, it's less troubling here because the paper is in the peer review literature, is a habit of getting work out into the media before it has been fully reviewed or fully vetted. And that's what Jim did in 2015. I kind of criticized him at the time for doing that kind of end run around the traditional scientific process. And keep in mind, peer review itself is not perfect by any means, but it's a vital kind of a predicate before you can start to get some sense of whether a new finding is robust and or just sort of deeply flawed. This one we'll see. And I may just end this broadcast right now, or I could walk you through a little bit of the again, the key findings of the paper, which are basically not only are we raising emissions of CO2, the main greenhouse gas, but there's been a big cleanup of oceanic shipping sulfates, the dirty pollution coming from ships. There was a changeover in the fuel recently that has created these a real amplified warming effect in some parts of the ocean basin. There's some graphics of this. This is a very long paper. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. Nope. Sorry, I'll get there. Yep. Total sulfate, percent of total sulfate from shipping. So you can see we created these veils over the ocean, big chunks of the northern hemisphere ocean basins where all the shipping traffic is. And as that starts to go away, there's some scientists who say that's one reason we've seen so much heating in the past couple of years. But there's a lot of contention about that as well, because the effects aren't simple. I think I am going to call it here and end this broadcast, just so I can get on with doing the reporting part. I just thought it'd be useful to share with you the what these briefings are like. Unfortunately, they couldn't fit in many questions, and I'll find the full video, which included almost an hour of presentations by the authors of the paper before they open it up to the press. I think they should have, of course, devoted more time to that, but that's how it works. Let's see. Let's go into social media one time. X. Let's see how this is playing in the exosphere. Yeah, there's been a big question that's been addressed by a lot of scientists recently, Zeke Hausfassler and others. Are we actually seeing an acceleration or not? And Hansen and et al. Were clearly, they're clearly saying whether you focus on this current moment, they have robust indications that because of the sulfate cleanup over the seas and CO2 still significant, 40 billion tons a year, you're going to get an acceleration of warming. And Jim, as he said today, was making the point that the ice shelf in Antarctica, Thwaites, and the ice sheet behind it are a big reason for concern. Let's go to videotape here, so you can, those who are just joining. No, that's me live. You need to see that. All right. For all those reasons, I want to say thank you for tuning in, and cut out and try to do some synthesis and pull some key moments from the discussion today. Thank you. This is Andy Revkin, Sustain What, taking you into the press conference around a significant new paper by Jim Hansen. One thing he did say today: we are geoengineering the planet right now, in the sense that artificially tuning, without really consciously doing it, the temperature of the planet in that balance between reducing CO2 or not, and taking away the sulfate veil, kind of like a mini volcano that from shipping and the cleanup of China's ocean. Take care.